Welcome to the Arms Control Primer, a podcast by the International Institute for Strategic Studies. I am your host, Alex Bollfrass, the head of strategy, technology, and arms control based in Berlin. On each episode, we welcome the world's leading experts in arms control to share their knowledge and assessments on the most critical issues. Whether you are new to the topic or need a refresher, please join us in our exploration of the nuclear past, present, and future. In this season, we examine the histories and policies of countries that may have had nuclear weapons ambitions or even nuclear arsenals, and gave them up. We search for lessons for non-proliferation, arms control, and disarmament. I hope it helps you better know a non-nuke.
South Korea under President Park Chung-hee started exploring the idea of developing nuclear weapons out of fear of abandonment by the United States and a sense of insecurity. President Park was very concerned that the U.S. would withdraw its troops that were deployed on South Korean soil.
Some in South Korea worried that Washington could be deterred from acting, fearing nuclear strikes on its own cities. That anxiety fueled domestic debates in Seoul over whether to pursue its own nuclear weapons, seek the redeployment of U.S. tactical nukes, or push for more visible form of allied nuclear planning.
Soon after signing the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, South Korea pursued a secret nuclear weapons program in the 1970s. Today, worried about the nuclear threat from the North and the reliability of American security promises, the Republic of Korea is debating its nuclear options. With us to explain are Dr. Lami Kim and Dr. Se-young Jang.
I'm Se-young Jang, EU Marie Curie Fellow at the History Department, University of Vienna. Previously, I was an assistant professor at Leiden University in the Netherlands and a Stanford Nuclear Security Fellow at MIT. As a diplomatic historian, I've been working on international nuclear history, the nuclear development on the Korean Peninsula, and U.S. foreign policy towards Korea. For more than 3 decades, from January 1958 to December 1991, the United States stationed nuclear weapons in South Korea. To understand why they arrived and why they left, we need to look at the bigger picture. Their story follows the changing patterns of the global Cold War. In short, the arsenal on the peninsula was a frontline expression of broader superpower strategy. So let's start from the year 1953. After 3 years of brutal fighting and enormous casualties, the Korean War halted with an armistice and a great deal of uncertainty at the time. The landscape it left behind was a bloody stalemate, divided peninsula, Seoul, the South's capital, sitting just 50 kilometers from the DMZ, and a North backed by China and the Soviet Union. Against that backdrop, Washington was looking for a way to deter another invasion without stationing an impossibly large conventional army in Asia. The answer in the logic of the time was nuclear. When Eisenhower took office in January 1953, the armistice talks were stuck, above all on the issue of prisoners of war. Eisenhower and Secretary of State John Foster Dulles later insisted that quietly signaling a willingness to use nuclear weapons helped break the stalemate. And after the armistice, they kept arguing that if the North and China launched a major attack again, the United States should be ready to use tactical nuclear weapons to stop it. After the war, Eisenhower confronted a new set of pressures. The soaring cost of global containment, a fast-growing Soviet arsenal, and domestic demands for lower taxes. Convinced that nuclear leverage worked, he unveiled the new look, a strategy that leaned on nuclear deterrence and air power, kept conventional forces smaller, and threatened escalation that adversaries couldn't match. On the Korean Peninsula, that translated into a nuclear backstop close at hand, intended to offset North Korea's massive conventional forces and any potential Chinese intervention. Then came the doctrine that sharpened the new look, massive retaliations. Dulles' message was blunt. push too far, and the United States would strike at a time and place of its choosing, potentially with nuclear weapons. On the Korean Peninsula, that logic led to forward basing. Although the Armistice Paragraph 13D barred introducing new types of weapons to avoid an arms race on the peninsula, the UN comment declared in June 1957 that North Korean violations had voided that restriction already. With that, Washington began deploying tactical nuclear weapons, atomic artillery, unstrung missiles, bombs, and atomic demolition munitions to the South Korea in January 1958. The deployment served three purposes. The first one, deterrence, to counter the sheer numbers of North Korean and Chinese conventional forces and raise the cost of any new aggression. Second, assurance, to convince Seoul that Washington's defense commitment was real, immediate, and anchored in place, not just a promise from afar. Third, restraint, to dissuade South Korean leaders from taking unilateral steps that could drag the alliance into a wider war against Washington's judgment. Those aims sat at the heart of U.S. strategy from the late 1950s through the end of the Cold War, shaping every crisis and exercise in between. Over the next decade, the U.S. nuclear arsenal on the peninsula grew larger and diversified. As many as 8 different types were deployed at once, and the stockpile peaked in 1967 at roughly 950 warheads, the all-time high, set against peak U.S. deployments of about 7,300 nuclear weapons in NATO and 3,200 across the Pacific. Through the 1970s and 80s, systems were withdrawn or retired and conventional capabilities improved. By the early 1980s, the South Korea stockpile was down to roughly 200 to 300 weapons, and by 1990 to about 100. President George H.W. Bush's 1991 Presidential Nuclear Initiative, PNI, came in the fast-moving endgame of the Cold War. The Soviet economy was collapsing. The August coup had shaken control of the Soviet military, and concerns about accidents or loss of control over tactical nukes were mounting. Bush ordered sweeping unilateral cuts, eliminating U.S. ground-launched short-range nuclear weapons, removing tactical nuclear arms from ships, attack submarines, and land-based naval aircraft, and standing down portions of the alert force, while urging Moscow to reciprocate. The remaining nuclear artillery and bombs in South Korea were withdrawn as part of the PNIs, completed by December 1991. The post-Cold War shift opened a new chapter on the peninsula. In early 1992, North and South Korea signed the joint declaration on the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, pledging to renounce nuclear weapons and to refrain from enrichment or reprocessing. Implementation soon faltered, but the baseline changed: assurance through the alliance, deterrence through stronger conventional forces, and nuclear capabilities kept off the peninsula, yet available if ever required.
My name is Lami Kim. I'm the Korea Chair in Advanced Technologies, National Security, and Defense at the AAAS. I recently joined AAAS after serving at the U.S. Department of Defense for 6 years. I researched the intersection between technology and international security, and I've been working on nuclear issues on the Korean Peninsula, both North Korea's and South Korea's nuclear ambitions. If you're interested in learning more about South Korea's nuclear hedging strategy, my forthcoming book, Everything But the Bomb, will focus on that, and so stay tuned. South Korea signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or the NPT, in 1968, And I don't think that South Korea at the time had the ambition to develop its own nuclear weapons, especially given the fact that it had joined other international agreements that are part of the non-proliferation regime. For example, South Korea had established safeguard agreements with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and also has signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. At that time, South Korea relied on the US's extended deterrence instead of pursuing its own, and I think that that contributed to South Korea's decision to sign the Non-Proliferation Treaty early on. However, things changed quite significantly around 1969 when President Nixon gave this notorious speech that is now known as the Nixon Doctrine, where he asked the US's allies to do more to defend themselves. Around this time, South Korea under President Park Chung-hee started exploring the idea of developing nuclear weapons out of fear of abandonment by the United States and a sense of insecurity. President Park was very concerned that the US would withdraw its troops that were deployed on South Korean soil. The US at the time had about 60,000 troops in South Korea. And because South Korea was far inferior to North Korea when it comes to military capabilities, South Korea was very concerned that without the United States, it won't be able to defend itself from North Korea's military threats. For this reason, President Park Chung-hee didn't ask the National Assembly to ratify the Non-Proliferation Treaty and instead started really pursuing seriously the option of its own nuclear deterrent. It is not really clear when exactly he started pursuing nuclear weapons. There's no official document authorizing the pursuit of nuclear weapons that have been declassified. But I think that it was around 1971 or 1972 when President Park ordered the development of nuclear weapons and missiles that can carry both conventional and nuclear weapons. South Korea decided to develop nuclear weapons, but it didn't have the capability to do so. It didn't have any nuclear reactors on its territory. The US's Westinghouse just started building South Korea's first nuclear reactor in 1971, which was not completed until 1978. Because South Korea at the time didn't have any technology, know-how, and expertise to develop nuclear weapons, it decided to seek foreign assistance, especially from the United States, Canada, and Belgium. And it was particularly interested in receiving France's reprocessing technology. And all of this was under the guise of its civilian nuclear program. But then in 1974, India tested its first nuclear weapon developed based on assistance that it had received from the United States and Canada, which was a big shock to nuclear vendors, especially the United States and Canada. And Washington, therefore, became more vigilant and started scrutinizing other countries' civilian nuclear programs. And they were particularly suspicious of South Korea's ambitions to develop nuclear weapons. And around 1974, shortly afterwards, they discovered that South Korea had a covert nuclear program. And there was a huge amount of pressure from Washington and Ottawa on South Korea to first ratify the Non-Proliferation Treaty and then ultimately renounce South Korea's nuclear ambitions. The United States threatened to withdraw its support for South Korea's nuclear energy program, and more importantly, it threatened to sever its alliance with South Korea. And the Secretary of Defense at the time said to President Park that the only reason that the US-South Korea alliance will be weakened is South Korea's ambition to build nuclear weapons.
The NPT was born of the Cold War, so drafted in the late 1960s and entering into force in 1970. And the treaty opened for signature on July 1st, and South Korea signed on day one, but it didn't ratify until March 19th, 1975. So that nearly 7-year gap raises questions. Why did South Korea sign the NPT on the first date? It opened for signature. And then why did it defer ratification of the treaty for so long? Most accounts blur the difference between signing and ratifying. There was no push from Washington, particularly targeting Seoul. And the South Korean Foreign Ministry didn't follow up that much with the NPT negotiations. South Korea, at the time, it was not a UN member, so they were not in the negotiating rooms in New York. They were clearly less informed. That changed on June 21st, 1968, when US Ambassador at the time, William Porter, asked Foreign Minister Choi Kyu-ha for a decision by July 1st, the opening signature day. Records suggest that the Minister Che hadn't been fully briefed about this issue, so implying there had been no high-level debate in Seoul about signing the treaty when it opened. On June 27th, Vice Foreign Minister told his U.S. counterpart that Seoul was considering signature but wanted clarity on security guarantees. The issue wasn't the NPT per se. It was the so-called Nuclear Umbrella Resolution that the UN Security Council passed on June 19th. That resolution pleads swift action by the nuclear-armed permanent members of the UN Security Council if a non-nuclear state was attacked with nuclear weapons. But from Seoul's perspective, it had two big problems. This resolution only applied to UN members, and South Korea was not a member at the time. And then any response could be blocked by a Soviet veto in the UN Security Council. The US side argued that the US ROK Mutual Defense Treaty already covered nuclear contingencies, and Seoul pushed it back, asking Washington to say so explicitly and to issue a separate assurance for Korea. Next day, the Foreign Minister Che pressed U.S. Ambassador Porter again, seeking written guarantees. Porter bristled, suggesting Seoul might be stalling to avoiding signing and warning that South Korea could end up in an unpleasant group by dragging its feet. And Che instantly fired back, pointedly questioning Ambassador Porter's conduct as an ambassador. The spat ended quickly when the U.S. Embassy produced an ad memoir the following day, faster than expected, stating that NPT would strengthen South Korea's security by reducing the chance of nuclear conflict and noting that U.S. nuclear umbrella resolution could never be as broad as a mutual defense treaty. An ad memoir isn't legally binding, but Seoul didn't dispute the format. It simply asked for revisions to some languages. Then came the sprint. Before the written assurance, the Foreign Ministry had planned to skip the Washington signing ceremony, but afterwards, it kind of mirrored signing a week later. And on January 1st, the day the treaty opened, the Foreign Ministry instructed its embassy in Washington to sign the treaty on the day. So why the final nod to that same day? So the paper thread is a bit thin, but the flurry of cables that particular morning on July 1st suggests Seoul was possibly pressing for stronger U.S. assurances until the last minute, and then once satisfied, they opted to move immediately.
South Korea wanted to pursue nuclear weapons in the 1970s, but had to look abroad for the technology. Lami Kim recalls the unsupportive reaction of the United States toward South Korea's nuclear intentions.
South Korea was particularly concerned about the U.S.'s threat to withdraw its security guarantee because South Korea's military capability was far inferior to that of North Korea at the time. And even if South Korea decided to build nuclear weapons and do that quickly, it would have needed sometimes several years to have a workable nuclear arsenal. During that period of time, South Korea would have been critically vulnerable to North Korea's military threats. So for this reason, South Korea eventually ratified the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1975. However, this doesn't mean that South Korea actually renounced its nuclear ambitions altogether, because it's kept pursuing, for instance, reprocessing technology, taking advantage of a loophole in the Non-Proliferation Treaty. This treaty doesn't ban the acquisition or development of enrichment or reprocessing, which allows for the production of nuclear fissile materials that can be used for building nuclear weapons, as long as IAEA safeguards are put in place. And South Korea argued that its pursuit of reprocessing technology is not illegal, and it is for its civil nuclear energy program. But eventually, in 1976, Washington convinced Seoul to officially shut down its nuclear weapons program by using both carrots and sticks. Carrots meaning more credible assurance of the US's commitment to defending South Korea, which included additional military assistance and also acknowledging the US's deployment of tactical nuclear weapons on South Korean soil, which Washington had neither confirmed or denied prior to that. In terms of sticks, the United States also threatened to withdraw its security guarantee. Eventually, South Korea ended its nuclear weapons program, but that doesn't mean that South Korea completely renounced its nuclear ambitions. President Park Chung-hee very interestingly said just 1 month prior to the official cancellation of the nuclear weapons program that South Korea would continue to acquire the capability to build nuclear weapons, just in a manner that doesn't attract foreign attention. Eventually, South Korea officially shut down its nuclear weapons program in 1976. However, its nuclear ambitions resurfaced once again. The United States under President Carter once again threatened to withdraw U.S. forces from South Korea. Eventually, not that many forces were withdrawn, but South Korea's sense of insecurity and fear of abandonment were reignited once again, and President Park Chung-hee started pursuing nuclear weapons in earnest again. It was not until after President Park Chung-hee was assassinated and a new president, Chun Doo-hwan, was sworn in, South Korea completely renounced its nuclear ambitions. Because President Chun came to power via a military coup, he didn't have much legitimacy to rule the country, and therefore he really needed the US's support. So in return for President Reagan's support for South Korea and his regime, Chun Doo-hwan completely eliminated the nuclear weapons program. And that was the end of South Korea's nuclear ambitions in the 1970s. Despite the growing calls for nuclear armament in South Korea today, South Korea is pursuing not nuclear armament, but rather nuclear hedging. To briefly introduce this term, nuclear hedging refers to the strategy to maintain the nuclear option open by acquiring the capability to build nuclear weapons quickly without actually crossing the threshold of nuclear armament. The reason why South Korea is pursuing this strategy instead of actually building nuclear weapons is because building nuclear weapons is risky. You cannot build nuclear weapons overnight. It takes several years to do so. Even for South Korea that has quite significant and sophisticated nuclear technology, it will take South Korea at least to more like 3 to 5 years to build nuclear weapons. And during this period, South Korea will be vulnerable to North Korea's nuclear threats, especially if the United States actually withdraws its security guarantee as it threatened to do in the 80s and 70s when South Korea was pursuing nuclear weapons then. And also, South Korea will have to suffer from economic sanctions, diplomatic isolations, and other penalties. And for that reason, South Korea is pursuing nuclear hedging, and to do so, it is pursuing enrichment and reprocessing. Because enrichment and reprocessing have legitimate use cases, for example, for naval propulsion for nuclear power submarines and nuclear fuel production and spent fuel management. So South Korea will have some sort of plausible deniability, meaning that they could argue that they are pursuing these technologies for other reasons than building nuclear weapons. Once South Korea acquires nuclear latency through enrichment reprocessing, it will become significantly easier to develop nuclear weapons. If it can develop nuclear weapons within months or weeks instead of within several years, the cost of nuclear armament will decrease significantly. This is not the first time that South Korea is pursuing nuclear hedging strategy. Back in the 1970s, South Korea pursued nuclear hedging when it became difficult for them to develop nuclear weapons under the pressure of the United States. South Korea continued to pursue reprocessing technology, arguing that it is not for building nuclear weapons, but to manage spent fuel from its nuclear reactors. At the time, though, this argument didn't really sound convincing because South Korea's civil nuclear energy program was still at a very early stage. Unlike today, where South Korea has 26 nuclear reactors, from which it is accumulating a large stockpile of spent fuel. South Korea at that time, in the 70s, didn't really need reprocessing. So judging from some declassified US government documents, Washington didn't really buy Seoul's argument that its pursuit of reprocessing was for a civilian nuclear program, but it was rather for its ambition to build nuclear weapons if need be in the future.
North Korea first tested a nuclear weapon in 2006. Se-Young Chung outlines the consequences of this growing nuclear threat on South Korean security and its relationship with the United States.
Since 2020, North Korea has expanded warhead and missile work, restarted plutonium and suspected uranium activities, fielded shorter-range tactical systems, tested new ICBMs, including solid fuel types, and in 2022 adopted a law lowering the threshold for nuclear use. Recently, North Korea has aggressively advanced its nuclear submarine capabilities. In December last year, North Korean media showcased what it described as an 8,700-ton nuclear-powered strategic missile submarine, a future SSBN concept rather than a proven platform. If Pyongyang can actually build and quietly operate such a submarine, it would move closer to a real second strike capability. But the timeline and feasibility remain uncertain at this moment. North Korea's evolving nuclear and missile arsenal is not just an abstract global concern, it sits barely 50 kilometers from Seoul and reshapes South Korea's security every year. First, the sheer proximity of the threat matters. Beyond the intercontinental missile system, North Korea's short-range and medium-range systems can hit anywhere in South Korea in a matter of minutes. That compresses warning time for leaders in Seoul, puts a premium on constant readiness and early warning networks, and demands hardened command and control that can function under stress. It also changes the dynamics of crisis. Once a confrontation starts, the ladder can be climbed quickly, leaving little room for slow, careful diplomacy. The character of North Korea's arsenal has also changed. Pyongyang no longer relies only on a small number of crude city-busting weapons. The development of more accurate, shorter-range tactical nuclear systems creates a spectrum of nuclear use options. For South Korea, that is dangerous because it lowers the threshold for nuclear employment. Kim Jong-un could threaten a limited nuclear strike against a military base or port, gambling that the United States and South Korea would hesitate to respond with full-scale retaliation. This escalation ladder complicates South Korean planning and weakens the comfort once provided by simple deterrence logic. These trends stress the US-ROK alliance too. South Korea's security rests heavily on the US extended deterrence, the promise that US nuclear and conventional forces would respond decisively to any nuclear use against the South. As North Korea fields more capable missiles, including those that can threaten US territory, some in South Korea worry that Washington could be deterred from acting, fearing nuclear strikes on its own cities. That anxiety fuels domestic debates in Seoul over whether to pursue its own nuclear weapons, seek the redeployment of US tactical nukes, or push for more visible form of allied nuclear planning. Each of those options carries costs for regional stability and for South Korea's role in the global non-proliferation regime. As North Korea's arsenal grows more mature and survivable, both sides may feel deterred from an all-out war. Yet Pyongyang may see more room for limited, calibrated provocation below that threshold. But the risk of a limited clash, whether from miscalculation or design, remains real unless the two Koreas reopen communication channels and pursue negotiations to bring peace to the peninsula.
Is South Korea likely to build a nuclear arsenal in the future? Lami Kim sheds light on the domestic nuclear discussion.
Unlike in the 70s, today South Korea is faced with North Korea's nuclear threats. North Korea became a nuclear weapon state when it tested its first nuclear weapon in 2006, and since then it has tested nuclear weapons several times more. And the last one, conducted in 2017, shows that North Korea might have developed a thermonuclear weapon or hydrogen bomb. And also, it has enhanced its missile capabilities. Now it has intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the United States, although it is not clear if it has the capability to launch a nuclear attack against the United States, because it still seems to lack what is called the re-entry vehicle that is required for such an attack against the United States. But it has also developed missiles that can neutralize missile defense systems, such as submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and then has tested hypersonic glide vehicles, although it is unclear whether North Korea has mastered these technologies. And since the collapse of the Hanoi summit back in 2019, any hopes for North Korea's denuclearization have been dashed. And back in 2022, North Korea legislated a law that enshrines its right to possess nuclear weapons and also preemptively use its nuclear weapons, lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons. In addition to enhancing nuclear and missile capabilities, North Korea has become increasingly hostile toward South Korea. It has recently designated South Korea as the primary foe, and also it is expediting its development of tactical nuclear weapons that can target South Korea. This development makes South Korea feel very nervous. Lacking nuclear weapons, South Korea is trying to deter North Korea's nuclear threats with its conventional capabilities. Although South Korea has pretty impressive conventional capabilities, still there is much skepticism over whether these conventional capabilities are sufficient to deter North Korea's nuclear threats. Hence, there are growing calls for nuclear armament in South Korea today. Public opinion polls in South Korea have consistently shown that the majority of South Koreans want their own nuclear deterrent. The Asan Institute, a prestigious think tank in South Korea, started conducting the survey asking this question back in 2010, when support for nuclear weapons was a little bit over 50%. Since then, support has grown quite substantially, especially since the collapse of the Hanoi summit back in 2019. And my colleagues and I conducted a survey that was published by the Chicago Council. We found that 71% of South Koreans want their own independent nuclear deterrent. What was quite interesting about our survey was that the vast majority of South Koreans want their own independent deterrent over the redeployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons. That said, public opinion doesn't necessarily translate into government policy. In fact, the vast majority of South Korean policymakers and security experts do not pursue nuclear armament, but instead they are focusing on nuclear hedging. Because nuclear armament can be very risky and costly, the greatest risk would be a preventive attack, as we have seen recently where the United States and Israel conducted an airstrike against Iran in order to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. There is a risk that North Korea could also try to prevent South Korea from acquiring nuclear weapons, especially because North Korea is inferior to South Korea when it comes to conventional capabilities. And so before South Korea acquires also nuclear parity in addition to conventional superiority, North Korea could take an action, especially if the United States withdraws its security guarantee because of South Korea's pursuit of nuclear weapons. Then South Korea will be critically vulnerable to North Korea's threats. And that could be economic sanctions, it could be diplomatic isolations, and nuclear energy disruption. And for these reasons, South Korean conservatives and liberals are both pursuing nuclear latency or the ability to build nuclear weapons quickly without crossing the threshold of nuclear armament. One major difference between the conservatives and the liberals is that the conservatives outrightly talk about acquiring nuclear latency as an insurance policy that would allow South Korea to build nuclear weapons if need be in the future, while progressives do not really disclose such intention but argue that nuclear enrichment or processing are needed for other purposes than building nuclear weapons.
What can the South Korean case teach us about non-proliferation? To answer that, we need to consider South Korea in two different periods, the 1970s and the present. In the 1970s, under President Park Chung-hee, Seoul actively explored a military nuclear option, but it ultimately shelved the program, not because of a single trigger, but because several forces converged. US pressure mattered, of course. Alliance leverage, aid, and the threat of sanction raised the cost of defiance. But the timing and context matters too. South Korea had just joined the NPT and accepted IAEA safeguards, creating institutional tripwires and international scrutiny. India's 1974 test catalyzed the nuclear suppliers group and fuller scope safeguards requirements. Key nuclear suppliers also tightened control. French and Canadian sensitivities over reprocessing and heavy water technologies closed pathway that Park hoped to use. At the same time, Washington paired caution with reassurance, reaffirming the defense treaty, maintaining troop presence, and signaling that Seoul securities wouldn't be abandoned. As South Korea's economy became more dependent on export markets and US technology, including nuclear energy, the opportunity cost of building the bomb grew clearer and politically salient. The lesson from the 1970s is that non-proliferation success is layered. The timing of external shocks, institutionalization, and legal constraints, supplier discipline, credible allied guarantees, and economic incentives work together. However, we cannot simply assume that success in the 1970s will lock South Korea into the non-proliferation regime forever. Today, Seoul sits next to three nuclear-armed neighbors, China, Russia, and North Korea. Pyongyang has been supporting Russia's war in Ukraine, including transfers of munitions, and Moscow-Pyongyang ties are the strongest they've been in decades, raising new security pressures on South Korea. There's another layer to Seoul's calculus, US-China tensions. As rivalry sharpens over Taiwan, sea lanes, and technology, South Korea faces the classic alliance dilemma: fear of abandonment if Washington is stretched thin, and fear of entrapment if a US China conflict pulls the peninsula into a wider war. A Taiwan contingency, for example, could disrupt maritime choke points, hammer Korea's trade dependent economy, and force difficult choices on leasing and logistics support. At the same time, Japan's nuclear latency is a persistent psychological benchmark. For South Koreans, the security environment around the peninsula sharpens existential anxieties. That helps explain why public support for nuclear options stays so high even as the government reaffirms non-proliferation norms. This uneasy balance has relied on US guarantees and visible reassurance, but the Trump administration's more transactional approach and its policy swings has led allies to question Washington's reliability. At the same time, the two competing fears of abandonment and entrapment are intensifying. A rare standoff in the West Sea between US and Chinese fighter jets last month alarmed ROK military leaders. heightening concerns about being drawn into a great power conflict. On the other hand, the Pentagon's recent redeployment of Patriot missiles and THAAD batteries off the Korean Peninsula to the Middle East reconfirmed lingering concerns about abandonment. So, if these volatile security dynamics around the peninsula coincide with any weakening of the global non-proliferation regime in the near future, South Korea's non-proliferation stance will be debated more seriously at home, and there is no guarantee that Seoul will hold the line as it does today.
There are some similarities and differences between South Korea's nuclear pursuit in the 1970s and its current ambitions. Back in the 70s, South Korea pursued nuclear weapons driven by its fear of abandonment by the United States and also military threats by North Korea. But it didn't have the means to develop nuclear weapons on its own. Today, South Korea does have the means to develop nuclear weapons indigenously without having to rely on foreign assistance. And arguably, the demand for nuclear weapons is even higher today than it was before because now, unlike in the 70s, North Korea has nuclear weapons, and the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence is arguably at one of the lowest points in history, especially since President's return to the White House. Although I would say that the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence was already pretty low prior to President Trump's comeback, which was demonstrated by the short-lived effect of the Washington Declaration, which I believe shows a pretty strong commitment on the part of Washington to defending South Korea. According to a poll conducted shortly after the announcement of Washington Declaration by President Biden and President Yoon Suk-yeol, support for nuclear armament dropped quite significantly from about 70% to 60%. However, only several months after that, support for nuclear weapons went back up to over 70%. But President Trump makes it very difficult for the U.S.'s allies to believe that the United States will come to their aid if push comes to shove. Given South Korea's greater demand for nuclear weapons and the means to develop them, the likelihood of South Korea's nuclear armament is greater today than it was before in the 1970s. However, restrictions that prevented South Korea from going nuclear back in the 70s are still in place, especially the threat of the United States to withdraw its security guarantee from South Korea. That worked in the 70s, and I think that it would work today as well. And so the carrot, which is reassurance of U.S. security commitment, may not be effective any longer because the credibility or confidence in that is so low already, but the stick may still work to a certain extent. That being said, if it becomes clear that the United States will not honor its security commitment anyway, then the stick of threatening to withdraw security guarantee may not work any longer.
Thank you for listening, our guests for speaking, and the European Union Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium for funding this series. Until next time, stay optimistic.